Welcome to Long History Short, where we discuss the historical context needed to understand today's global politics. I'm your host, Brian Stahl. Boko Haram, the jihadist terrorist group, has been engaged in an insurgency against the Nigerian government since 2009. Boko Haram became notorious around the Western world in 2014 when they kidnapped 276 schoolgirls, most of whom were Christians. Recently, President Trump threatened to cut off foreign aid to Nigeria after he accused the government of failing to protect its Christian population. President Trump has also threatened to employ U.S. military forces to combat Boko Haram. To understand the conflict in Nigeria, first we need to get an understanding of Islam and Islam's relationship with Christianity. Let's get started. Joining us today is Professor Gabriel Reynolds. Professor Reynolds received his PhD from Yale in 2003 and holds an endowed chair in the theology department at the University of Notre Dame. He is the author of several books about Islam and about Islam's relationship with Christianity, and he serves on the Vatican Dicastery for interreligious dialogue with Muslims. I'd also like to add in a personal note that he was my professor a long time ago, and he was a man who had a profound impact on me both intellectually and spiritually. And with that, I'd like to say welcome, Professor Reynolds.
Thank you very much, Brian. Delighted to be on Long History Short, and happy to connect with you again.
For sure. So before we get started, would you mind talking a little bit about your own intellectual journey? You're a devout Catholic who is a world-renowned scholar of Islam. That's a pretty particular niche. How did that come about? How did your interest in Islam develop?
Yeah, thank you for having me on and give me a chance to speak a little bit about my journey. I always think it's important to sort of tell your story. You know how you engaged with sort of the topic at hand and how that is part of your life. In my case, my story is not very exciting, so this first this first answer may be the low point of our episode, Brian. But I come from the suburbs in the Northeast in Connecticut. Was from a just barely religious family, Catholic mother, Protestant father, not very practicing, didn't really know anything about Christianity. I mean, would never read the Bible. I had really no idea what Christian teaching about anything was, just the most vague notions. When I was in undergrad, however, I ran into some very faithful evangelical Protestant Christians who started, evangelizing me, talking to me about the Bible and things. And I was like, wow, this is actually kind of interesting. I always thought it was boring and stupid, as a high schooler, especially I think like that was kind of a low point. I don't know. I was in high school in the late 80s, early 90s. And at least in the Northeast, it was like nothing going on in terms of religion. So I had this kind of Christian engagement as an undergrad, and then I went off, I think after my freshman year, it might have been after my sophomore year, for the first time to the Middle East. So I spent a summer in Jordan and Syria, and it didn't take long to sort of discover that Islam is like this really intense, uh, really, devout religion in which it's very public as well. So immediately you hear the call to prayer. Many people may not know, not only is the call to prayer broadcast through loudspeakers, but also usually Quran recitation before the call to prayer. And in Amman, Jordan, for example, where I landed and kind of discovered Islam for the first time, you're hearing like 4 or 5 mosques at once, all at high volume. On Friday they also broadcast the sermon for the communal prayer, which for Muslims is on Friday. So you hear the sermon from 4 or 5 mosques going on at the same time. I mean, sometimes I joke, like, imagine that churches tried to do that in New York City or somewhere. That would not go over well in the American scene. So, I mean, that was just like really intriguing to me. I don't think I was ever really sort of attracted to converting to Islam, but I definitely wanted to get to know Muslims. Like, why are you guys so religious? Why do you love the Quran so much? Why do you love Muhammad so much? I mean, everyone's talking about religion. And that kind of started my intellectual journey, went back, ended up majoring in Arabic Middle Eastern studies as an undergrad, went on and did a PhD in Islamic studies.
Okay, thank you. So let's talk about Islam a little bit. Most people know a few basic facts. They know that Muslims worship Allah. They know that Islam is an Abrahamic religion, that Muhammad is the prophet of Islam, and that the holy book is the Quran. What are some other core central teachings of Islam that a lot of people may not be as familiar with?
Yeah, great. I mean, you really hit on the central points for Islam. I mean, it's important to note that as a religion, Islam has teachings which, for Muslims, come from God. And that may seem like a simplistic statement, right? But someone can just sort of think on their own and come up with ideas about God and humanity. That's what philosophers do, right? They just kind of think things through, come up with their own ideas. Some end up believing in God, some don't, right? But Islam, like any religion, begins with the principle that God has sent messages to humans. And in those messages, he's basically done two things. He's shown something of himself. So it's, hi guys, this is what I'm like. Like, I don't know, if your teacher one day in class begins to sort of tell stories of his childhood or something, he's choosing to show you something of his own character, right? So God does that in Islam. And then God does another thing, which is he reveals his will for humans, how he wants them to act, what he wants them to believe. And so, these are kind of the starting points, right? And so what did God show about himself? As you said, that God is the only God, and that he has certain attributes, that he's merciful, that he sort of is in control of everything. He created the world and controls it. And then what did God show about his will for humanity? Sort of everything. So this word Sharia, that lots of people will know, doesn't mean just like a few kinds of punishments for different crimes. It means God's will for all of every sphere, every element of human life. So God, among other things, taught the world how to worship him. So 5 times a day in Arabic, facing Mecca. You should have mosques. They should be like this. Here are the words to use in prayer. Here's the washing you have to do before you pray, what people call ablutions. All the details. You don't make up how you worship God. God revealed to you. Now, how did God communicate these two things, that is his nature and will, by sending prophets? And this is where, of course, Muhammad is super important, which we could speak further about that. But God didn't sort of speak to humanity directly, and definitely did not enter the human family as Christians believe about Jesus in the incarnation. But he communicated through a prophet, and the last and greatest of the prophets for Muslims is Muhammad.
Okay, well, that's a great start. So, what do we know about the life of Muhammad? Neither you nor I are Muslim, and so we are going to obviously have a different perspective on this
Mm-hmm,
than a
mm-hmm,
lot of Muslims would.
mm-hmm.
But for someone who comes at it from, or either a Christian background or a Jewish background or secular background or whatever, what is agreed upon and known about the life of Muhammad?
Great. Yeah, terrific. So this is really key. Sometimes even Muslims will speak about Islam as though it's really about monotheism. But Islam is not Islam without Muhammad. If you just become a bland monotheist, well, listen, I believe in one God, and then you just, say, I don't really have any particular prophet, or I've got another prophet that I think is even better than Muhammad, that is not good enough, right? So I think that's an important point. Islam ultimately is about Muhammad. So Muhammad is the one who tells you what God is like. Muhammad is the one through whom God communicated, as I mentioned before, giving us instructions about how to live. So, I mean, the center of everything is Muhammad. It's true that, Muslims do not consider Muhammad divine. Muhammad is not worshipped. So that's true. But nevertheless, like every aspect of human life, it comes through the teachings of Muhammad. So for this reason, Muslims, when they mention his name, especially religious Muslims, they'll often add peace and blessings be upon him. For this reason, Muslims will not show the face of Muhammad in like a movie or a painting, because they consider him so holy, so venerable, that he can't be shown. Whereas Christians actually, even if they believe Jesus, Son of God, they have no problem showing the face of Jesus. So I mean, that's just an important point to begin with. As for his life, Brian, I mean, maybe a first step is just to give a couple of like basic or a basic outline of the traditional idea of his life. If we start talking about sort of the academic, historical, critical debate over what can really be known about Muhammad, that's a whole other situation. So the basic traditional idea is that Muhammad was an Arab from a pagan city called Mecca, which is on the western side today of Saudi Arabia. For Muslims, it was a city that was basically established by Abraham himself and his son Ishmael. The building that's at the center of the holy shrine in Mecca, which is called the Kaaba, was built by Abraham and Ishmael. Muhammad was born in the year AD 570, so about 600 years after Jesus. When he was 40, he began receiving revelations from the angel Gabriel, continued to receive revelations for the rest of his life. He died in the year 632, AD 632, in another city to the north of Mecca named Medina. And, he established this new community, which God blessed, sort of they vanquished their enemies, established the first Islamic state there in Western Arabia, and would go on, to expand through the Islamic conquest in a sort of lightning fast way, expanding into Africa and Asia and eventually into Europe. So, yeah, it's a very, very quick outline of traditional ideas.
No, that's all great. And that actually kind of brings me into my next question, too. So, one of the things about Boko Haram is that, according to their foundational documents
Mm-hmm,
and
mm-hmm,
ideas, they want to purify Islam.
mm-hmm.
And specifically, they are Sunni Muslims.
Yes.
And one of their primary targets are Shia Muslims.
Mm-hmm.
What is the distinction there? My understanding is that that split came pretty much right after the passage of Muhammad and after sort of a leadership crisis of some
Yes.
sort. Can you talk to us about that?
Yeah, right. So the key figures, Brian, as I'm sure are Abu Bakr, who became the first leader of Islam after Muhammad. The term Muslims use is caliph. So Abu Bakr, who was not related to Muhammad, excuse me, but um, was his daughter Aisha was Muhammad's beloved wife, and he was a faithful friend of Muhammad. So he actually became the leader. Sunni Muslims say, that was good. Abu Bakr was probably the best of the companions. It was right that he became the leader. But there seems to have been a dispute with another man who is Ali. And Ali is related to Muhammad. He's the cousin, paternal cousin, so from the same family. So Muhammad's father is Abdullah. Abdullah's brother is Abu Talib. And Abu Talib's son is Ali. So he's a cousin, paternal cousin of Muhammad. He also married Muhammad's daughter, Fatima. So he's connected also through marriage. He was also the son-in-law of Muhammad. Yeah, so Shiite Muslims say not only would Ali have been a better choice than Abu Bakr, but in fact, Muhammad designated Ali, explicitly designated. That's not a claim that Sunnis make about Abu Bakr. Shiites say, or Shia, that he explicitly designated Ali as his successor. And so what happened after Muhammad's death, when Abu Bakr became the first caliph, was in direct contradiction to the will of Muhammad. So now there's a lot of things that go down between 632, the death of Muhammad, and the rise of Boko Haram in Nigeria. But you're absolutely right that Boko Haram is part of a current of Sunni Islam that has grown throughout the 20th century and still today in the 21st century, and see themselves as purifying Islam, and see movements like Shiite Islam as the kind of thing that needs to be set aside to recover Islam's original purity.
Okay. And can you talk to us a little bit about that current of maybe, I don't know if you'd call it radical Islam or if you or just pushing for purification? My understanding is that a lot of Muslims who fall into that broad set of ideas are either Salafi Muslims or Wahhabi Muslims.
Right, right,
Can you
right.
tell us about those two sects a little bit, or about maybe some
Mm-hmm.
distinctive beliefs of that sort of purificatory brand of Islam?
Yes, yes. So those are really overlapping terms, but 100% right that Boko Haram fit within the larger movement, which is a little bit vague and ambiguous. It's not sort of an organized denomination as a Christian group might be, but that larger current called Salafism. Wahhabism really, I mean, some people might define it in a different way. The name comes from a particular leader associated with the foundation of Saudi Arabia, but really it's kind of another name for the same thing. And that thing, so let's just talk about Salafism. That thing is a movement which grows in, its roots maybe in medieval Islam around a figure named Ibn Taymiyyah. But it seems to me that he's kind of summoned as an intellectual sort of forebearer to defend the legitimacy of the movement. It's really a modern movement. In order to explain it, I don't want to go on and on because I know we want to get to current events and what's going on in Nigeria. But it's important to know that the way Sunni Islam, kind of mainstream Sunni Islam, works is that the heart of Sunni Islam is working through what the religious law is. The key question for being a Muslim is law. Is such and such a thing forbidden or permitted? Yeah? Is it haram or halal? There's actually other grades in between those things, so we could go into depth about it. But this is the central question for Muslims. God has imposed a law on humanity. It's not clear. The details of the law are not clear in the Quran or in the Hadith, the sayings of Muhammad, and so you have to work it out. Can I eat this or that animal? Can I shake the hand of someone from the opposite sex? When I'm doing my washing, my ritual washings, do I have to wash my ear, or how do I wash my nose? Or do I have to wipe my head? How many hairs on my head do I have to wipe? I mean, there's just endless questions, right? So Sunni Islam, at the heart of it, is sorting out Islamic law, what you should do and not do. Now, how do you do that work? Traditionally, there are certain schools which provide answers, and it's not only actions like your ritual washing. It could also be beliefs about politics, democracy. Is democracy accepted? So traditionally, all Sunni Muslims are in one of these schools, and you follow the tradition of that school, and that tradition's developed through the centuries, and ask questions that didn't exist in the beginning, like democracy, or can you drink coffee, or can you smoke a cigarette? There was no coffee, there was no democracy, there were no cigarettes. Right, so Sunni Muslims usually trust the whole kind of sweep of tradition in their particular law school. In the 20th century, basically, some Muslims kind of stood up and they said, you know what, we don't like this at all. We're going back to the beginnings, to what we think was a golden age of Islam. We're going to set aside the tradition, which we think, as you said or alluded to, has corrupted Islam. And we're not going to complicate things. We're just going to keep it simple. We're not going to allow things like theology, philosophy, I don't know, ideas of ethics that might come from notions of human rights or whatever. None of that is going to affect us. We're just going to stick to the OG original thinking of Muhammad and the first companion. So that is Salafism. It is not necessarily a violent movement. It is not the same as jihadism. It can be. There are Salafi jihadis. We'll be talking about some of them in a moment. But it can also be perfectly peaceful, not interested in jihad at all. It's the method of setting aside the tradition that makes Salafism Salafism.
Fascinating stuff. And you talked about that big body of laws. Is that what we sometimes refer to as Sharia law?
Basically, yeah. There's some other terms that, if you want to get into details. But yeah, so Sharia law is not just cutting off the hand of a thief. It is the whole kind of history of speculation on every day, what should you do? What should you think?
Okay. And sometimes you hear about movements like Boko Haram that they want to, quote unquote, impose Sharia
Yes,
law on
yes,
people.
yes.
This basically just means make everyone, regardless of their religious background, follow at least their interpretation of Sharia law. Is
Yeah, I
that
mean it's such a weird thing to speak about because, from one perspective, it's right, and it's kind of a good way of describing it, right? Because they definitely want to set aside the International Declaration of Human Rights or notions of democracy in which the majority get to decide stuff, about everything from zoning to, I don't know, recycling, right? So that's true. Like anything that's coming from outside of Islam, as they would see it, like they want to get rid of that. So yeah, it is the imposition of Sharia law, but there is actually no such thing as Sharia law. Like there's the concept that God has a will for everything, but even questions of can you drink coffee or smoke cigarettes, can you have a 401k plan? Like there's nothing of that in the Quran or the Hadith, the sayings of Muhammad. So when people speak about that, like Boko Haram, they don't have a book of Sharia law that they're going to impose. They just have to figure things out on their own. I don't know if that kind of makes sense.
It does make sense. No, that's very helpful. Backtracking a little bit, can you tell us, before we get anywhere near current events, can you tell us a little bit about the historic relationship between Christianity and Islam? Like when Muhammad first lived, what was his relationship with Christians, and then in the immediate aftermath, and then how has it kind of evolved and changed over time? I know I'm asking you to talk about 14 years or 1400 years of history, but if you could just maybe in a broad sweep talk about that stuff.
Yeah, it's a difficult story. I mean, today everyone likes to speak about Abrahamic religions. Pope Francis signed this document on human fraternity with a Muslim ruler. It's actually co-authored, not just co-signed. But most of those 1400 years are stories of conflict, enslavement, polemics, all of that stuff. We don't know that much actually from a critical point of view about the life of Muhammad. Something where we could say we're 100% sure about this or that. So again, I'll just give you kind of the traditional idea, which is anyway what really matters, because that's what Muslims have recourse to. So traditional idea actually is that Muhammad got along pretty well with Christians. So there were not Christian communities in Mecca or Medina, according to the traditional idea, although I've just published a book which says that there were. But forget about that for a moment. And instead, there was a community of Jews in the city of Medina. There were Christians in the periphery. So he sent some of his followers to Ethiopia, which was a Christian country, and they were protected there by the Christians. There were Christians who visited him from another place in Arabia. There were a couple of Christian figures, a couple of monks and others who sort of affirmed that you truly are a prophet. So, I mean, the beginnings are sort of good from that perspective, according to the traditional story. But, at the end of his life already, the Muslim forces are expanding into the heartland of the Christian Middle East. 636, 637, Muhammad died 632. They conquered Jerusalem, the holiest city in Christianity. They will go on in a few years to conquer Antioch and Alexandria, which, along with Jerusalem, are three of the five cities that have a Christian patriarch. So, incredibly holy cities for Christians. 711, they will cross the Strait of Gibraltar. It's called Gibraltar because of the guy who crossed it. And, invade Spain, conquer Spain, and occupy, or depends on your perspective, until the end of the Reconquista in 1492. And, it just goes on and on. Obviously, Christians fight back and at times make advances into Islamic countries. Plus, intellectually, there's all sorts of accusations.
Okay, wow, that was a really good job of just going through that
Thank you,
1400
thank
years
you.
kind of very snappily.
I
Okay,
just skipped over stuff. That's my trick.
that's fine. That works well. So we've been talking a lot about the spread of Islam, and obviously it's spread down into Africa, and for the purposes of what we're talking about, kind of particularly into sub-Saharan Africa. How has Islam in sub-Saharan Africa developed, and in what ways is it distinct from Islam maybe in the Middle East or Eastern Europe or maybe like Southeast Asia? What makes it distinctive in that region?
Great. Yeah. So, I mean, Nigeria is one of the most important uh, Islamic, I probably shouldn't say Islamic countries, one of the most important countries with significant Muslim populations in the world. I hesitated there because it's about half Christian. And Christians would definitely, not, Nigerian Christians would not like me calling Nigeria an Islamic country. Definitely, definitely not. So, but, it's a country with a massive population. It's got to be one of the, so, Indonesia India, Pakistan, I think, have the three largest Muslim populations, but Nigeria is not too far behind. So it's a very significant country in the sort of global scheme of Muslim or Islamic countries. Islam develops there relatively late. So, immediately after the Prophet's death, Islam begins to spread into northern Africa. And as I mentioned, 711 is the date of crossing the Strait of Gibraltar. So by that time, what is today kind of Egypt, Libya, Algeria, Tunisia, Morocco, all that northern stretch, Muslims have reached there. Many of the people are still Christians there. But and then at a pretty early stage, it spreads south from Egypt in eastern Africa into what is now Sudan and Ethiopia. That's a very difficult story because there's mass enslavement there. But it's centuries later that Islam crosses over the Saharan desert. So unlike the story of Christianity in West Africa, which begins with first the Portuguese and then the Spanish coming by sea along the western coast and all the way around the Cape of Good Hope, the western coast of Africa, uh, Islam comes from what is Algeria and Libya and Morocco south across the Saharan desert into eventually what is today Nigeria. Now, one thing that's very distinctive about Nigerian Islam and really West African Islam as a whole is the importance of Sufi orders. I don't know if there's any part of the Islamic world in which Sufism is more important than it is in West African Islam. So Sufism is a movement which is marked by associations, almost always of men. There are some exceptions, but almost always of men who tend to have certain prayers and certain spiritual lifestyles which are distinctive. So these are in addition to the 5 daily prayers and other Islamic practices. They have additional prayers, and it's marked by the central role of one figure, the sheikh. There's some other words, basically the leader and spiritual guide, who has more or less absolute leadership over his community. So, ironically, Boko Haram is violently opposed to Sufism, as most Salafi groups are. They're seen as innovations, inappropriate, illicit innovations. But this is how Islam begins to spread, along with a regular practice of enslavement. Obviously, Europeans are involved with this as well, but so are in West Africa the Muslims who come from Algeria, Morocco, and Libya. This was considered, for Muslims cannot enslave other Muslims. So by going across the Saharan desert, where there are people following African traditional religions, these were fair game for enslavement. But very often, as happened with Christian slavery, once they become slaves, they learn about Islam and become Muslims. And and then either they or their children will be manumitted, so they'll be free, and now they're Muslims, and so a community begins to grow among formerly enslaved peoples. So that's the early story. I've probably gone on too far already. Things change in the 20th century with the arrival of Salafi Islam, which is highly encouraged directly from Saudi and a couple of other countries, but principally Saudi financial support. And it kind of gets out of control. And now today, under Mohammed bin Salman, Saudi Arabia is trying to sort of oppose these groups. But it all kicked off with the ideological influence and the money of Saudi Arabia.
Fascinating. Since we're talking again about kind of radical Islam, Salafi Islam, one of the names I've heard tossed around about this topic a lot, and I'm sure I'm going to butcher the pronunciation, is Saeed Kateb. Is that how you
Yes,
pronounce that?
yes, yes.
Okay. Can you tell us a little bit about him, his ideas, his life, and whether his impact has really kind of shaped modern day Salafism or jihadism?
Yeah, so he is like often referred to, and rightly so, because it really was super popular in Egypt and beyond Egypt. But he's not the only one. there are certain reasons for his popularity. There are a couple of reasons. So this is a figure who, initially in the first part of the 20th century, he's kind of like, run of the mill, mainstream Sunni Muslim in Egypt, nothing really extraordinary. And eventually he becomes part of a couple of things happen. I'll mention one of them. He becomes part of this movement known as the Muslim Brotherhood. And he becomes sort of an advocate for violence and jihad within the movement. So I could say a bit more about that if it's interesting. But the reason why he became so popular, I mean, part of it is like he had a cool look. That probably sounds dumb, but like if people like I don't know, like everyone knows what Mao looks like, or Stalin, or certain figures, Che. Like people know what people these guys look like, and then it's just kind of the iconic images just rally more attention to these figures, and maybe more attention than they deserve. So anyway, other things that made it popular. One is like his story of radicalization is often told beginning with his time in the United States. So for 2 years in the late 1940s, he went to Colorado and was there basically to observe schools because he had a job with the Ministry of Education. And that he later wrote a book which is called The America I Have Seen. And I mean, the books make it seem like he was just totally scandalized by what he saw in Colorado in the 1940s. Actually, it's a funny book. He does have a sense of humor, tells various anecdotes there. I mean, there's funnier things than this, but he does say, American football is the worst possible sport. Everyone's violent. The mothers are saying like, tear up, destroy the other team, kill him, kill him. So why the heck is it called football? They don't even use the foot. So he has remarks like that. Anyway, that's one, like people like that part of his story. It's a kind of a cool way to tell a story. The other thing is that he was ultimately executed by the Egyptian government. So there's a famous story of his imprisonment, and then he became a martyr for the cause. Yeah, I mean, I could speak more about his ideas, other figures within kind of the Salafi world, but certainly, at least in the West, he is the most famous.
Okay. But you wouldn't say that he was maybe like an intellectual godfather of the movement or anything like that per se. He was kind of more of a like an icon. Is that your take?
Yeah, I would say low key intellectual godfather and definitely icons. So, I mean, the movement, in a sense, didn't really need Sayyid Qutb because, already before him, its principles were established. So, what are the principles of Salafism? One of them is disassociation with non Muslims. So, there's an Arabic term which expresses this, and it basically means like stick with Muslim. So, this has real significant implications for social life. Like you shouldn't even greet your Christian neighbor. You shouldn't say assalamu alaikum. It has implications for how you dress. You shouldn't dress like a Westerner with a tie or whatever, um, or some of the brand names. You should not have any of like any holidays, for example, that are not Islamic. So obviously no Christmas, no Easter, but also no New Year's, because Islam doesn't have the standard calendar that we have in the West. But even like a national holiday, in Salafism, a lot of Salafi, like Independence Day in this or that country, would be like, we don't care about a state. Like this whole idea of a state is imposed on us by non-Muslims. And then when someone like Sayyid Qutb or someone else observes like alliances that say Egypt might make with America, let alone Israel, like, this is horrible. The central principle is disassociation with the unbelievers. So, I mean, I could go on and on, but you could see like already that principle that can like have a substantial impact on the way that a Salafi Muslim would engage with the world, from the case of your neighbor to the case of international politics and the global scene.
Sure. And when they say disassociation with non-Muslims, does that include what they would see as heretical Muslims like Shia and Sufi? Do they or is some level of association
Great
allowable?
question. Yeah, terrific question, Brian. So the basic answer is yes. It would include that. However, If someone like Sayyid Qutb, I'll mention some other names to get some other guys some airtime here. Part of that kind of current in Egypt is a very influential figure known as Yusuf Akaradawi, who's connected with the Al Jazeera network, now famous in the US as well, and some Saudi figures like Bin Baz, Ibn al Uthaymeen, Al Albani. So, if you ask one of those guys, like, oh, can you greet a Sufi or, a Muslim who does this or that they shouldn't do, maybe a lady who's not wearing hijab? I mean, there it gets complicated. And if you ask 5 Salafis, you may get 5 different answers because, it's just there are different ways of approaching a question. The principle of disassociation in Arabic, it's al-wala wal-bara, usually is understood to apply to non-Muslims. But nevertheless, some Salafis would say that Shiites are not Muslims. Other kind of people who claim to be Muslims are not Muslims. And some of them would also say folks who can still be called Muslims because they are publicly engaging in behavior which is undermining the Islamic project, they need to be reprimanded and treated in a way which makes it clear that they need to repent and return to the fold.
Wow. Okay. Now, with respect to, because we talked about the origins of Sunni and Shia Islam, but it's occurring to me now we didn't actually talk much about the actual theology or the actual differences in beliefs. Can you tell us a little bit about some of the things that they besides the initial leadership
Abu
crisis,
Bakr and Ali.
right?
Yeah.
Besides after that, what are some ways that their theology or their beliefs, understandings of Islam developed that keep them apart still?
Right. So, really, the key bit is the sources that they refer to for Islamic teaching. I think that's a key bit. Maybe there's more than one key bit. But, I've mentioned the Hadith, for example. So, Muslims, both Shiites and Sunnis, agree on the Quran. No question, this is a book of God. But actually, Islamic law is principally shaped by the Hadith. So, these reports about what Muhammad said or did. And the Hadith are fundamentally different for Sunnis and Shiites. And the biggest reason for that is that Shiites believe that God established a line of righteous leaders after Muhammad. Not only Ali was the first, the son-in-law and the cousin of Muhammad, but after that there were 11 more. And these figures, although they're not called prophets, they do channel and communicate God's guidance to the world in a way that is very close to prophets. So they report hadith, like a hadith for a Shiite could come from one of these imams. It doesn't have to come only from Muhammad. Consequently, all the content there, it may be different from the content in the Sunni hadith. So, I mean, how does this actually play out? Well, it plays out in kind of details of how you pray, how you fast. For example, Shiites can combine their 5 prayers into 3 prayer times, which Sunnis cannot. They have to be 5 prayers at 5 different times. So these sorts of things, even the way you hold your hands, Shiites will keep their hands by their side in prayer, where Sunnis will have them like this. So you can immediately tell if it's Shiite praying in a mosque. But also, things that we may not notice, rules about marriage, like Shiism has this idea of temporary marriage, which Sunni Islam rejects. Inheritance laws are different. So really, like, just a function of everyday life as a Muslim is different for Shiites.
Okay, so it started as the leader and then it just kind of grew and developed over time
I think that's a
into
good way of putting it.
almost, it seems like, I mean, from your description, almost every facet of life, almost really.
Right. And then
A lot of
also,
them.
yeah, 100%. And also, Brian, I mean, there's stuff that's not just kind of religious, Shiites were mostly persecuted, or the persecuted minority throughout Islamic history. So it's a little bit difficult to describe, but this had real kind of social, cultural implications for the development of Shiism. Sunnism was dominant and triumphant, basically until the age of colonialism, which led to a massive crisis, which might have contributed to the rise of Salafism. They're just used to, because we're the true religion, we keep on winning our battles, dominating people. We're never dominated. So that, and then as you probably remember, the Shiites are concentrated really in certain areas. The overwhelming majority of Shiites are in kind of one stretch from Iraq, including Iran, and including parts of Pakistan. There are Azerbaijan, Bahrain, Lebanon. There's little pockets here and there, but really it's that one stretch where probably 90% of Shiites live.
Okay, so it's largely geographical as well. Okay,
Yes, yes.
very interesting stuff. And then I guess some have also traveled down to Nigeria because my understanding is that that's sort of Boko Haram's primary target. I mean, Christians kind of get a little bit more airtime on the news, but is it? I mean, or maybe that's a misconception. Is it the case from
Uh,
what you know, from what you
yeah,
can?
I mean, in terms of sheer numbers, there are very few Shiites in Nigeria. In terms of the propaganda that Boko Haram uses, 100%. They bring up kind of the threat of Shiites. It's a kind of um, I don't know, way of just kind of leveraging that name in order to increase sort of the urgency to their followers. There are threats all around. It's not only the Christians and maybe the United States and Israel, but it's also Iran and the Shiites. They're kind of everywhere. But in terms of actual numbers, there are very few Shiites. Not only are there very few in Nigeria, but in all of Africa. It's basically just pockets of converts from Sunni Islam to Shia Islam here and there, but there's no significant communities. It's true that Sufi Islam is still significant in Nigeria, so that is a target of Boko Haram, but their number one target are Christians. Christians are sort of the existential threat for Boko Haram.
Okay, okay. Well, that's good to know because I had another guest on here who said the exact opposite. So it's good to get your perspective on that. That's wonderful. So, Professor, we are just about out of time, but I want to thank you for your time and your knowledge.
Thank you, Brian. Very happy to be with you on Long History Short. And yeah, be great to do it again.
Hopefully, one day. All right.